So I'm back again. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and share in the great congratulations to Jeff on a terrific career and terrific award from our association. So this is the time for our last speaker, and I know the reason that many of you came today. It's my distinct honor to introduce our keynote, a gentleman by the name of Ray Kurzweil. Here's what I'd like to tell you about Ray. Ray's one of the world's leading innovators, thinkers, and futurists with a 30-year track record of accurate predictions. He's been called the restless genius by the Wall Street Journal, the ultimate thinking machine by Forbes magazine, and he was selected as one of the top entrepreneurs by Inc. magazine, which described him as the rightful heir to Thomas Edison. PBS selected him as one of the 16 revolutionaries who made America. He was the principal inventor of the first CCD flatbed scanner, the first omni-font optical character recognition, the first print-to-speech reading machine for the blind, the first text-to-speech synthesizer, the first music synthesizer capable of recreating the grand piano and other orchestral instruments, and the first commercially marketed large vocabulary speech recognition. I gotta take a breath after I say all that. That's a pretty incredible career, but that's not all. Kurzweil's many honors. He's the recipient of the National Medal of Technology and was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He holds 19 honorary doctorates and honors from 3 U.S. presidents. Ray's written 7 books, 5 of which have been national bestsellers. The Singularity is Near and Ray's latest book, How to Create a Mind, have been New York Times bestsellers. Ray was recently appointed as Director of Engineering at Google. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Ray Kurzweil.
Thanks. Well, it's great to be here. Bob Metcalf and I used to hang around in Boston, sharing tips on innovation and looking at new companies, and Bob has moved to Austin. I now have a full-time job in Mountain View, California. It's actually my first job. I thought I'd squeeze in a job before I turned 65, at least for a company I didn't start. And in fact, I was pitching Larry Page in July for a new venture that I was going to start based on my most recent book, which I'll talk a little bit about, How to Create a Mind. And the idea was to apply the biologically inspired methods based on how the brain processes information to artificial intelligence, so that search engines like Google could be based on natural language and concepts and not just keywords. And he said, don't do that. Do it here. And he convinced me that Google had resources that I wouldn't find if I raised all the money I would like, that would really enable me to do this work. Things like the knowledge graph, which has 700 million concepts, basically all the concepts in the world and their relationships. And that is very useful, and there's quite a few other things there. So this is an exciting new venture of mine. But I'd like to share with you some reflections on innovation and the history of innovation, going back 200 million years ago. I'll cover the first 100 million years quickly. 200 million years ago, the neocortex evolved. It's a brain structure that only mammals have. In these early mammals, which were rodent-like creatures, it was the size of a postage stamp, just as thin. Neocortex means new rind, so it's a covering over the brain. But it enabled these animals to do hierarchical thinking. They could think in flexible ways. They could recognize patterns, even if the pattern was a little altered or hidden. They could find new ways of solving problems based on the hierarchy of the actual world. And they could learn new behaviors. Animals without a neocortex couldn't do that. They had pre-programmed behaviors. They could learn new behaviors too, but not in one lifetime. Over maybe 1,000 lifetimes. Using biological evolution, a new behavior could evolve. That was fine 200 million years ago because the environment was changing very slowly. new changes wouldn't occur for thousands of years. So as the environment changed slowly, these animals could evolve new behaviors and keep pace. Then something happened 65 million years ago. We call it the Cretaceous extinction event. There was a violent, cataclysmic, sudden change in the environment. We see geological evidence for that all around the globe. If you dig down to an area of sediment reflecting 65 million years ago, the geologists can explain that this rock formation reflects a very violent, sudden change in environment. And so the animals without a neocortex couldn't evolve new behaviors quickly enough. They had now weeks, not thousands of years. The mammals, though, many of them were able to handle that. One would invent some innovation to deal with the new environment, maybe accidentally, that would spread virally through that population. And that is when mammals overtook their ecological niche. Thousands of other species died out. That's why it's called the extinction event. And mammals then took over. And to anthropomorphize biological evolution said, oh, this neocortex is pretty good stuff. And it kept growing it as mammals evolved. And as you get bigger mammals like cats and dogs, and then primates, the neocortex then took on all these fissures and ripples, basically to increase its surface area. But even in a human, it's still an outer covering. It's got all these convolutions. You could still stretch it out. It'd be about the size of your table napkin. It'd be just as thin. It's still a thin covering, but it's so convoluted that it comprises now 80% of our brain. And there was an innovation in humanoids, which is basically we have this big forehead, to squeeze in more neocortex. And neuroscience talks about all these specialized regions. The fusiform gyrus recognizes faces, and V1 recognizes primitive features of visual objects. But actually, the organization of the neocortex is all the same. This was noted by Vernon Mountcastle 50 years ago, and he said neocortex is neocortex. And actually, dramatic evidence that came out just before my recent book came out is what happens to V1, which is responsible, generally speaking, for visual recognition of very simple features like the crossbar and a capital A. What happens to it in a congenitally blind person? Does it just sit there waiting for visual information to come in? Actually, it is harnessed by the frontal cortex to deal with the highest level abstract concepts in language. So here's this region that's supposed to be devoted to very primitive features, is actually doing high-level concept recognition, showing the interchangeability of the neocortex, and it's all basically the same. I'm going to come back and describe a little bit more about how the neocortex works, but we basically have a larger quantity of it. It's not qualitatively different. So the frontal cortex in this big forehead was the enabling factor for us to invent technology and language and art and science and music. No other mammal, including the primates, did that. I mean, there's some discussions that chimpanzees can master simple forms of sign language. Actually, if you look at the kinds of language they deal with, it's very simple object, verb, subject, verb, object. They're not able to actually put together these very complex forms of language with hierarchies that we're able to handle. And so the enabling factor for all the innovation you see here at this conference is our neocortex. And the neocortex then has had its own evolution, and that we've had cultural and technological evolution, and that's been very much like biological evolution, and that the most advanced technologies survive. And we use the latest technology to create the next. And that is why technology accelerates and information technologies grow exponentially. And I want to come back to that concept because it's very important. But we've seen a continual acceleration in innovation. Our very first invention, which was spoken language, so that we could basically pass on lessons, tell people what we did that day, tell stories. Basically, the story was the first invention. That took hundreds of thousands of years. And then people noticed that stories were drifting from one storyteller to the next, so we wanted some permanent record, and we invented written language. And that was much faster. That only took tens of thousands of years. Then we wanted a more efficient way of distributing written language, and the printing press was developed half a millennium ago took 400 years to reach a mass audience. I gave a speech at the 550th anniversary of the University of Basel, and that was founded 20 years after Gutenberg's invention, and right where he invented the printing press. And I said, wow, that's exciting. You must have had some of his books when you opened your doors. And they said, yes, we got them very quickly. It was only a century later. So that is how innovation spread in those days, but that was fast compared to some of the earlier inventions. The telephone took only 50 years to reach a mass audience, a quarter of the US population. The cell phone did that in 7 years. Social networks, wikis, blogs took 3 years to reach a quarter of the population. So there's been a continual acceleration. And what drives that acceleration is something I call the law of accelerating returns, which is that information technologies grow exponentially. They double their power every period of time, which right now is approximately a year. So that means right now you can get the same amount of computation you got a year ago, or communications, or biological technologies, genetic sequencing, as you could get a year ago for half the price. And actually people worry about deflation, because that's a 50% deflation rate, and the economists worry about, well, if you can get the same stuff, and I'll talk about three-dimensional printing in a moment, so I'm literally talking about physical things as well, for half the price, you'll buy more. That's economics 101. But are you really going to double your consumption? And if you don't, so let's say you only increase it 50%, after all, how much do you need? Then the economy, not as measured in bits, bytes, and base pairs, but as measured in constant currency, will shrink. And for a variety of actually good reasons, that would not be a good thing. And that's actually not what happens. We actually more than double our consumption. There's actually been 18% growth in every form of information technology per year for the last 50 years, despite the fact that you can get twice as much of it each year for the same cost. And the reason for that is innovation. As price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications just explode. I mean, why didn't social networks take off 8 years ago rather than 4 years ago? Was it because Mark Zuckerberg was still in junior high school and wasn't motivated to find a better way of meeting girls? It was the price performance wasn't there. There were social networks 8 years ago, and they had arguments. Can we really allow our users to download a picture? The price performance couldn't really support that application. When it could, it exploded. And this kind of exponential growth is amazingly predictable, and I'm going to show you a few examples of that. We have actually over 100 examples of that. There's a very pervasive predictability to this exponential growth of information technology. Now, there's many things that aren't predictable. I mean, you could have predicted, and I did predict, that search engines were needed and were becoming feasible about 15 years ago. The fact that it would be these couple of kids in a Stanford dorm with their late-night dorm room challenge as to whether or not they could actually do the mathematics to reverse the links on the internet, that they would take over the world of search, that would have been very hard to predict. But the fact that search engines were coming and the cost-effectiveness of that technology was now coming into place 15 years ago, that was feasible. So I want to show you just how this law of accelerating returns, this exponential growth, drives innovation. And it's a constantly accelerating course, and we're right now at sort of the knee of the curve, where we're going to see innovations at a faster and faster clip. The fact that new capabilities that are impossible at certain points of time become feasible is a great opportunity for innovators, because you can actually look at, gee, what is going to be feasible 3 years from now? And I get a lot of business plans and technology plans. I do some early stage investing and mentoring, as Bob Metcalf does. And many of these plans act as if the world 3 or 4 years from now is going to be the same as it is today. Maybe cell phones will be a little smaller, or maybe they'll be a little bigger, but there will be no fundamental change. Think back 3 or 4 years ago, people didn't use social networks, wikis, blogs. That sounds like ancient history. That wasn't so long ago. And I first began to think about this over 30 years ago. It was 1981. I realized that to be successful as an inventor, timing was critical. The inventors whose names you recognize, like Edison or Larry Page. They were in the right place at the right time with the right idea. There were many other people who were a little bit early, a little bit too late. I realized the timing had to be critical, and I couldn't aim at the world that I saw. It's like skeet shooting. I had to think, what is the world going to be like 3 years from now? And even 30 years ago, things were not changing as fast as today, but they were changing fast enough for me to realize I had to really anticipate what that world would be like. And I began to study this, and I adopted or accepted the common wisdom that you cannot predict the future. I didn't really think that you could absolutely predict it, but being an engineer, I gathered a lot of data. I thought maybe if I visualized it in the right way, if I squinted at it, I would be able to see some vague trends and make some educated guesses. What I discovered was quite surprising. If you measure the fundamental measures of the power of information technology, price, performance, capacity, bandwidth, they follow these amazingly predictable trajectories. And the trajectories are exponential. In the case of computation, this goes back to the 1890 census. It's not just Moore's law. It was happening long before there were chips. And it's not only predictable, but the nature of exponential growth is very surprising. And to go back to our brains, we really have brains in order to predict the future. If you wonder, why do I have a brain? It's really to anticipate what's going to happen. But these built-in predictors are linear rather than exponential. Our intuition is not exponential, and that's the primary difference between myself and my critics. They're looking at the current situation and saying, well, based on what we see, and this is going to take centuries, not years. For example, halfway through the Genome Project, we had finished 1% of the genome. And so mainstream critics were saying, well, told you this wasn't going to work. Here you are 7.5 years into this project, you finished 1%. It's going to take 750 years, just like we said. My response at that time was, oh, we've done 1%, we're almost done, because it's an exponential progression. And once you get to 1%, you've got some traction. That's only 7 doublings from 100%. And indeed, that's what happened. It kept doubling every year and was done 7 years later. And every other aspect of biology has considered to ramp up in this exponential manner. But when our brains evolved, tens of thousands of years ago, and we were walking through the savannah, and I look up and, okay, that animal's going towards that rock, and I'm headed up this way towards the rock. We're going to meet up there. I'm going to take a different path. Turned out to be good for survival to make those predictions, but those predictions were linear, and that became hardwired in our brains. And the kinds of challenges we had thousands of years ago were not exponential, trying to track an animal in the wild, and the other things we thought about were linear. There was no information technology at that time, except perhaps for spoken language. But that was progressing so slowly that nobody noticed it. And so exponential growth is not intuitive, but it's very powerful. Because if we take 30 steps linearly, and that's our intuition, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get to 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, and that's the reality of information technology, I go 2, 4, 8, 16. Doesn't sound that different, but by step 30, I'm at 1 billion. It makes a profound difference, and this is not an idle speculation on the future. I mean, this is several billion times more powerful than the computer I used when I was a student at MIT. It's thousands of times more powerful. It's millions of times cheaper. There's a several billion-fold increase in price performance. It's 100,000 times smaller. We'll do both of those things again in 25 years, and it gives you some idea of what will be feasible. So this is what I wanted to cover today. Any questions on any of this? All right, I'll cover it a little more slowly. But exponential growth, once it gets to the knee of the curve, begins to explode. And we've seen that already. And we're just getting to the point where it's interesting and will ultimately transform everything we care about. This is the first graph I had in 1981. Well, I had it through 1980. This is the power of computers. So calculations per second per $1,000. And it's a constant $1,000. This has now been updated to 2009, and people go, oh, Moore's Law, but Moore's Law is just the part on the right. When I first had this graph, Moore's Law had been underway for 8 or 9 years. In the 1950s, they were shrinking vacuum tubes to make them smaller and smaller to keep this exponential growth going. In 1952, CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower, the first time the networks did that. Remember that? I don't remember it. I was only 4 years old. But finally, they hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. I have a little museum, and we have a computer with tiny little vacuum tubes, and that was kind of the end of the line for vacuum tubes. But the law of accelerating returns, as applied to computers, just jumped to the fourth paradigm, transistors, and then to chips. And this modest little curve represents trillions-fold increase, because this is a logarithmic scale. As you go up the scale, we're multiplying by powers of 10. Each labeled level on this is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. So since the 1890 census, the first one to be automated, this represents trillions-fold increase, several billion-fold, just since I was an undergraduate. But the most amazing thing is, look at how smooth a curve that is. I mean, where's World War I or World War II or the Great Depression or the Cold War or the recent recession? People say, well, it must have slowed down during the recent recession. I mean, if you hang around this organization or in Silicon Valley, people will disabuse you of that notion. But it's had absolutely no effect, nor have any of the recessions or boom times. It has a mind of its own, goes through thick or thin, war or peace. Nothing has any effect on this very smooth exponential growth, and you can actually predict where it will be. In fact, we are exactly where I predicted we would be in 1981, because I just extended this curve. It's a double exponential. This is exponential growth on this logarithmic scale, and we're right where we should be based on my projection from 30 years ago. So I don't want to dwell on these examples of electronics, but the curve on the top there is kind of a nice example. I used to hang out at these surplus electronics shops on Canal Street in New York. I recently went back, and they're still there. But in the early 60s, I'd buy something about this big that could actually switch a bit of information for only $50. It was a telephone relay with support circuitry. It was very slow and cumbersome. I was excited in 1968 I could buy a transistor that was much smaller, faster, for only $1 that did the same thing. You can now buy billions of them for $1. They're better again because they're smaller. The electrons have less distance to travel, so they're faster. The cost of a transistor cycle has been coming down by about half every year. So that's why you can buy an Android phone or an iPhone that's twice as good as the one 2 years ago for half the price. That's a fourfold increase in price performance. And we've put some of the improvement in price performance in better performance. That's why cell phones today, do a million things, according to the Apple or Android ads, do a pretty good job of phone calls, and they're much less expensive. We put some of that price performance improvement into lower prices, but this fuels constant innovation because new and better applications become feasible. Here's one example of consumption. Bits shipped, it's been 18% growth in constant dollars, despite the fact you can get twice as many bits of memory each year for the same cost. Time magazine had a cover story on my idea, and they wanted to so this is my computer graph, and they wanted to put a particular computer that they had covered in the magazine as the last point. I said, it just came out. It might not be cost effective. It's not going to be above the curve, but it might be below. But it's actually right on the curve. And this is a curve I laid out in 1981. So it's been very predictable. Cooper's Law, Singularity University, which I co-founded with Peter Diamandis and Larry Page, was involved in founding it, and Google was the first sponsor. Martin Cooper is on the faculty. He invented something you may be familiar with, the mobile phone. And Cooper's Law, which is a very smooth exponential growth in the number of bits we move around wirelessly, back to a century to when we were moving Morse code over AM radio. Now we have 4G networks. This represents trillions-fold increase because every level on this is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. It's a logarithmic scale. But again, look at how smooth the progression that is. Internet data traffic smoothly doubling every year. Same thing on Ethernet, which Bob invented, and we still is a major technology. Here's a graph I had in the early 80s. I had the first few points on the left-hand side. This is the size of the internet, which was then called the ARPANET. And it was really just for American scientists to share information files. There was only a few thousand scientists. And I did the math and said, wow, this is going to be a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people to each other and vast knowledge resources by the late 90s. And people thought that was nuts when the entire American defense budget could only tie together a few thousand people. But that's the power of exponential growth. That is what happened. The graph on the right is the same data, but on a linear scale, not a logarithmic one. And that is actually how we experience the world. So to the casual observer, it looked like, whoa, the World Wide Web's new thing came out of nowhere. You could see it coming if you looked at the exponential progression. Now, this is an important one. This law of accelerating returns does not just apply to electronics and computers. It applies to anything where we are dealing with the phenomena as an information process. And biology is fundamentally an information process. But that's actually not how health and medicine was organized. We didn't have the object code of biology up until we finished that genome project in 2003. So health and medicine was hit or miss. We would just find things. We organized the information with computers, but really didn't develop innovations as an information process. And biology fundamentally is information. It starts with our genes. These are little software programs. For example, I have one little software program inside me called the fat insulin receptor gene. I trust you have it too. Basically says hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. That was a great idea thousands of years ago when our genes were evolving because you worked all day to get a few calories. There were no refrigerators, so you stored them in the fat cells of your body. I would like to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't need to do that anymore. I'm confident the next hunting season will be good in the supermarket. And that was done, actually, at the Joslin Diabetes Center. We now have technologies to turn genes off or add new genes. So they turned off the fat insulin receptor genes in these animals, and they ate ravenously and remained slim. And it wasn't a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes. They didn't get heart disease. They lived 20% longer. They got the health benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. And they're working with a drug company to bring that to the human market. I'm involved with a company where we take cells out of the body, non-invasively, scrape lung cells out of the throat, and these are in patients who have a particular disease caused by a missing gene. Now, most diseases are not one gene, one disease, but this one is. And if you're missing this gene, you'll get this terminal disease where your life expectancy is 1 or 2 years from diagnosis. So we take these cells, which are missing the gene, add the gene in a petri dish, so it doesn't trigger the immune system, which is one of the problems of the old form of gene therapy. Expect that it got done correctly, replicated several million-fold. Now we have millions of cells with that patient's DNA, but with the gene they're missing, inject it back in the body, it goes through the bloodstream, ends up back in the lungs, and this has actually cured this disease in human trials, and it's undergoing more trials. And these are just 2 of hundreds of examples where we're basically going to reprogram the software of life. We'll have not just designer babies, but designer baby boomers, which I'm personally a lot more interested in. But we're learning the genetic triggers of cancer and heart disease. I'm involved with the Cancer Stem Cell Project at MIT, where we've actually noted the genetic changes that cause an ordinary stem cell to become a cancer stem cell and are the progenitors of cancer. And the reason that chemotherapy doesn't work very well is it kills cancer cells, but it doesn't kill the cancer stem cells, and they're responsible for metastases, and you got to get them also. We've actually identified several drugs which kill the cancer stem cells, and this is actually going to go into human trials with pancreatic cancer patients within the next month or so. Part of what's fueling this is the exponential growth of all these information technologies, underlying biology. I mean, there's the growth in the amount of genetic data. The cost of DNA has come down by half each year. It was $10 per base pair in 1990. It's a few hundredth of a cent today. First genome cost $1 billion. It's now approaching $1,000. NIH is collecting 1 million genomes to do a master comparison of disease states to genetic states. They wouldn't do that if the genome still cost $1 billion. So as price performance comes down, whole new possibilities become feasible. Another technology that's an information technology that's going to revolutionize the world, but we're actually in that sort of quiet before the storm because the specs are not quite there, but you can see that they're coming. Three-dimensional printing. So if I want to send you a book or a movie or a sound album, 3 years ago even, I would send you a FedEx package. Today I can send you an email attachment, and you can then create those products from the information. Well, I can actually today send you this violin or this guitar or that elaborate assembly on the upper right. If you have the right three-dimensional printer, you can print it out. In the middle there's a kiosk in Japan. You can go in and be scanned, and then it creates a little miniature three-dimensional figurine of yourself. But this is going to revolutionize manufacturing. For most applications, we need the scale of precision to be submicron. Right now, it's a few microns. The cost needs to be $1,000 or less. It was hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands. Now it's thousands. It'll be under 1,000 within a few years. Today, with a three-dimensional printer, you can print out 70% of the pieces you need to print out another three-dimensional printer. That'll be 100% in 5 to 7 years. So we'll be able to send one three-dimensional printer to Nigeria. They'll print out another one. The two will print out 4. The 4 will print out 8. Pretty soon, everybody in Nigeria will have a three-dimensional printer. This uses very inexpensive input materials and the right designs. And people go, oh, this is going to destroy the economy because, there will be, for example, millions of designs of open source information files where you can print out different clothing and physical things you need. At Singularity University, we have a project to print out houses for the developing world, one module at a time, and snap them together Lego style. So you'll be able to print out most of the things you need. But look at what has happened now to music, books, and movies. You can have a very good time with millions of free, legal, open source sources of books, movies, music, and some of it's very good. Yet people still pay for the proprietary forms to get Harry Potter or the latest blockbuster or their favorite musical artist. And even though there's a lot of gnashing of teeth of radical changes in business models, if you look at the overall revenue of those industries, they've remained quite vital, despite the fact that there's open source forms of this information, and even despite the fact that there's illegal downloading of proprietary forms. These industries have done quite well. And the same thing will be true of everything else. So you'll actually be able to print out clothing in the 2020s when we have multi-nanometer scale, but you'll still pay to get the latest designer brand design and then print it out on your three-dimensional printer. So let me say a few words about thinking and the brain. I mentioned the importance of the neocortex, and I've been thinking about thinking for 50 years. I wrote a paper actually 50 years ago, which was my Westinghouse Science Talent Search submission, about the same subject, which is how the brain works and how to use those biologically inspired methods to create artificial intelligence. And I described the brain then as a large collection of pattern recognizers. We weren't very good at logical thinking, but we were very good at recognizing patterns, and we have a large number of pattern recognizers in our neocortex, and we really didn't know how they worked, but I said they were organized in hierarchies, and based on this model, I wrote a program that could recognize patterns in musical melodies and then write original music based on the patterns it had discovered. So I could feed in Chopin, Mozart, and would then write original music that sounded like those musicians. And so I was one of the winners that got to meet President Johnson in Washington, and I took my computer on I've Got a Secret, which probably most of you is before your time. But I came on and played a piece of music, and then my secret was I had built a computer that composed the music. That was revealed to the home audience, and the celebrity panel needed to guess it. And this book, which just came out recently, says basically the same thing, except now we have the neuroscience evidence to support that thesis. The spatial resolution of brain scanning, different types, MRI, destructive, non-destructive, non-invasive, are all scaling up exponentially, basically doubling in spatial resolution each year. We can now see inside a living brain with enough precision to actually see your brain create your thoughts, and more importantly, see your thoughts create your brain, because that is the secret of human thought. This whole hierarchy we create with our neocortex is created by our own thinking. So it's true you are what you eat, but it's even more true that you are what you think. So be careful who you hang out with. I think if you hang out with the entrepreneurial community here in Atlanta, you'll be doing well. But we actually create our neocortex with our own thinking, and we create one conceptual level at a time. I've got a 1.5-year-old grandson, and he has successfully laid down several conceptual levels. You can see a newborn is just dealing with very primitive sounds and shapes, and it takes us quite a while to build up a meaningful number of levels of abstraction. But we create that with our own thinking. I've counted them, or at least I've estimated them, and I drive this in the book. We have about 300 million pattern recognizers. And they're all basically the same. They use essentially the same algorithm, but they can recognize a pattern. This is a model of it, but I'll give you one example which will illustrate it. There's a lot of redundancy because they're not totally reliable. So I've got probably hundreds of pattern recognizers that recognize a crossbar and a capital A. And that's all they care about. I mean, a beautiful song could play, a beautiful girl could walk by, they don't care. But they see a crossbar and a capital A, they get very excited. And they send off a high probability on their output axon saying, capital A, crossbar of a capital A. And that goes up to a higher level, it's getting other primitive features, and that module will say, we've seen a capital A. That'll go up to a higher level that might then say, we've seen the word apple. Or if it has seen, let's say, A, P, P, and L, because the letter recognizers coming up to it have said that they've seen those, it'll say, there's a very good chance we're going to see a capital E, and it'll actually send a signal down the hierarchy to all the E recognizers, say, be on the outlook for an E, because I think an E is coming. And then if you see something that's sort of smudged and could possibly be an E, the E recognizers will say, it's good enough, and we'll say, okay, we've seen an E. So there's actually information going up and down. The information going down is what we expect you probably were anticipating me to say the word C. So we're constantly anticipating what we expect in the environment. And very often we recognize what we expect to recognize, even if it's really not there. And at the lowest level, there's these recognizers that deal with very primitive features. If you go up another 5 or 6 levels here, you're now at a pretty high part of the hierarchy, and that's getting information from all of the senses if you go down its hierarchy. So I might see a certain fabric, hear a certain voice, smell a certain perfume, and I'll go, my wife just entered the room. Go up another 10 levels or so, and now you're dealing with very abstract features, like that's beautiful, that's funny, that's ironic, she's pretty. You probably think that those high-level abstract recognizers are much more complex and sophisticated, and they tend to be in the frontal cortex, than the ones that just recognize edges of objects and crossbars. They're actually fundamentally the same algorithm. That is what Vernon Mountcastle saw 50 years ago, although we didn't have the means to understand how it worked at that time. They're actually fundamentally the same. The difference is where they are positioned in that hierarchy. The neocortex is actually one pattern recognizer thick, but the hierarchy is created by the connections between these recognizers, as illustrated here in this simple example, and we create those connections with our own thinking, and that is really the key to human thinking. And there's complete interchangeability. If you have a stroke and one part gets knocked out, so the reason we know that the fusiform gyrus generally recognizes faces when somebody knocks out that region through an accident or a stroke, they suddenly can't recognize faces. But then a different region will take over, maybe a little resistant to taking over because it wasn't sitting around doing nothing, but it may have to give up some of its redundancy so that it can replace the function that's been lost. There's a tremendous amount of evidence of the interchangeability of these different regions. And through our own learning and experience, we create this whole hierarchy. So is 300 million a lot or a little? Well, it was enough, that quantitative improvement, when humanoids developed this frontal cortex and we had more neocortex, to enable the invention of language and art and science and technology and innovation. If it wasn't for that quantity, we wouldn't be doing those things. Other mammals with a neocortex, they can do some flexible problem solving, but it's not enough for them to actually invent a whole evolutionary process of technology development. But it's also quite limited. Anytime you get frustrated, it takes so long to read one book or to master a new subject or learn a new language, we run up against the limitation of 300 million. Sometimes we'd like more. Well, these communication technologies enabled us to increase it. So if we had spoken language and groups could get together and you could have 5 people maybe solving a problem and exchanging their ideas. It's not perfect communication. We have all these very powerful communication technologies now. We have collaboration software. Recently, a few hundred mathematicians who hadn't met each other were able to solve a problem that had remained unsolved for a century. And they did it in weeks, and they'd never met each other, but using collaboration software, they were able to solve it because they increased the neocortex, but basically by harnessing the neocortex of multiple people. But we'd like to go even further than that, and we will be expanding our neocortex. Now, for one thing, these brain extenders we have, I mean, this does make me smarter. I've been managing work groups for over 4 decades, and I can have a group now of a few people in a matter of weeks do what used to take hundreds of people years. So we're definitely more productive and smarter than we used to be. This, in a way, is expanding my brain right into the cloud, because I mentioned this is several billion times more powerful per unit cost than the computers I used when I was a student, but that's not even the most significant thing about it. This is fundamentally a gateway to the cloud. If I do an interesting search, a language translation, ask Google Now or Siri a question, it doesn't take place in this little box. It goes out to the cloud. And the cloud is a pure form of information technology that is doubling in power every year. That'll be 1,000 times more powerful in 10 years, 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years. And basically, this is a gateway for my brain to the cloud, but it's intermediated by my having to interact with this physical device. It'd be better to actually put it in our brains. Another exponential trend is the shrinking of technology. I've measured that at a predictable factor of 100 in 3D volume per decade. So this kind of technology will be the size of blood cells in the 2030s. Technology at that time will be millions of times more powerful per unit cost than it is today. We'll be able to send intelligent nanobots non-invasively through the capillaries into the brain, where there basically will be gateways to the cloud. And so if you need not 300 million, say you need 400 million pattern recognizers for a few seconds. Just like if I need 1,000 computers or 1,000,000 computers in the cloud, I can actually access that with our devices. We'll be able to have these models of our neocortex based on the way the biological neocortex works and expand our neocortex directly in the cloud. And so if I need 1 billion or 10 billion for a few seconds to think a bigger thought or think of something that's funny to say because somebody I want to impress is approaching me, I'll be able to do that. And that will then be a very pure extension of our brains, and that will grow exponentially because the cloud is doubling in power every year. So think about what happened the last time we expanded our neocortex, when we developed these large foreheads as humanoids. That was the enabling factor for language and technology and art and science. If you were to ask a pre-language humanoid, gee, what it's going to be like when you apply this new frontal cortex you have to create all these innovations, what's that going to be like? He or she wouldn't be able to answer because they didn't have the language to do it. And similarly, we can only answer by this analogy today, but we will be quantitatively increasing our neocortex by expanding it into the cloud, and that will lead to a similar qualitative leap in the profound importance and power of the information structures we can create. The feasibility of natural language is understanding computers was demonstrated by Watson. Watson got a higher score than the best 2 human players put together. Its knowledge that enabled it to answer these Jeopardy questions was not pre-programmed by the engineers, Watson read Wikipedia and several other encyclopedias. That's where it got its knowledge. So it read all the 200 million pages of natural language documents, and it also can understand these very convoluted Jeopardy queries. For example, a long, tiresome speech delivered by a frothy pie topping. And Watson got that correct by responding, "What is a meringue harangue?" And Jennings and the other player, the best two Jeopardy players in the world, were not able to answer that. And Watson got a higher score than the two of them put together. A very effective demonstration of the power of computers to understand natural language. That is what I'm going to be doing at Google. And it's basically, so search will not just be based on keywords. It's amazing how well that works, but we'll actually be able to ask complex questions in natural language or give a whole précis about the kind of thing we're looking for, and it will search knowledge based on concepts and not just words. That's basically what I'm working on. So I'll just sum up by showing you this graph. This is the progress we made before health and medicine was an information technology, when it was just hit or miss. We made linear progress, but that was still pretty good. I gave a speech recently to junior high school students, and I said, you all would be senior citizens if it hadn't been for this progress, because life expectancy was in the 20s 1,000 years ago. We've quadrupled it in the last 1,000 years. It was 37 in 1800. Schubert and Mozart died in their 30s, and that was typical. There was no antibiotics, no understanding of the germ theory of disease. It's not pushing 80, but this is going to go into high gear when we get to the mature phase of the biotechnology revolution, which is basically applying information technology to biology, which is fundamentally is an information process. And it's been a decade since the genome was collected. The earliest fruits of this are now going into clinical practice. My father had a heart attack in 1961. It damaged his heart. That's true of 50% of all heart attack survivors. He could hardly walk, then died of that in 1970. Today, you can fix that with stem cell therapies, basically by reprogramming your adult stem cells to be heart cells and using them to non-invasively rejuvenate a damaged heart. I've talked to people who could hardly walk after a heart attack and are now normal. That's just one example. We're going to be able to really reprogram biology away from disease and away from sources of aging. According to my models, 15 years from now, we'll be adding more than a year every year to your remaining life expectancy. So you go forward a year, your life expectancy will move on away from you, and the pace will continue to pick up steam. So if you can hang in there, we may get to see the remarkable century ahead. Thank you very much. So there's a microphone there. I don't know if there are any others, but surely there's something I didn't cover. So we have time for questions.
I've got one for you. Your critics have said that you've been extremely optimistic about the outcome of a lot of these technologies, and obviously you've been proven right over time in certain aspects, but I would like to ask you to speculate on the nature of the future in the overall human evolution, actually. Specifically, whether we will win that race against computer evolution versus biological evolution. And by biological evolution, I mean the technologies that you're saying will incorporate into our bodies.
Well, I've actually written, technology is a double-edged sword. Fire kept us warm, cooked our food, but also burned down our homes. And technology has always had both creative and destructive aspects to it. We've seen a lot of destruction made feasible by technology in the 20th century, 180 million people killed. Nonetheless, there's actually a sharp exponential decline in death by violence. People say, what are you talking about? Just, look at your cell phone and see what's going on in the world and how violent it is. Steven Pinker has a book, Our Better Angels, which documents this exponential decline. Your probability of being killed violently today worldwide is 500 times less than it was 4 centuries ago. And that's because we have a much greater abundance. There was extreme scarcity in those days. These communication technologies are also fundamentally democratizing. And we have much better knowledge today of what's wrong with the world. So there's a battle in Fallujah. We're there. We experience it. 100 years ago, there could be a battle in the next village, and you wouldn't hear about it because we didn't have the communication technologies. And we forget what things are like. People say, oh, well, I travel around the world, and I speak to many different audiences, and there's a strong school of thought that the world is getting worse, and these problems are getting worse, and a subset of that school of thought is that technology is responsible. And I've got actually several dozen of graphs like this, but this is the world in 1800. Income per person in today's dollars on the x-axis. It was in the hundreds of dollars. Those are all countries. The big red circle is China. On the y-axis, it's life expectancy, which was in the 20s and 30s. Worldwide average 1,300. But what happens over the 200 years is that all these countries go from the lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner very smoothly, and there's still a have-not divide. There we go. So there was slow movement in the early 19th century, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As we reach the 20th century, you'll see a wind that carries all these countries in the upper right, and there's still a have-not divide, but the countries that are worst off at the end of this process are far better off than the countries that were best off at the beginning of this process. And I shouldn't say end of the process because the process is actually going into high gear, and particularly when we get things like three-dimensional printing where we can print out the basics of life at very low cost. This will move much faster, but the countries that are worst off are far better off than the best countries at the beginning of this process. And we forget what things are like. There's a lot of focus on what's happened, trends that are happening over a few-month period, and they become highly politicized. But I remind people to read Thomas Hobbes, who describes life just a couple hundred years ago as short, brutish, disaster-prone, poverty-filled, disease-filled. We've come a long way in overcoming the sources of human suffering. Nonetheless, there are existential risks. The same technology that's enabling us to reprogram biology away from disease can also be applied today by a bioterrorist to create a new biological weapon, making, let's say, biological viruses more deadly, more communicable, more stealthy. I've actually worked with the U.S. Army on developing a rapid response system for that. We do now have one. We can sequence a virus in one day. HIV took 5 years, another example of this acceleration. So we could have a whole conference on that subject. But fundamentally, we've been helped more than we've been hurt. And it's really innovators like yourselves who are responsible for applying these increasing powers of information technology to actual practical solutions to problems.
Thank you.
I'm curious if you have any predictions around where things are heading with the ability to use technology to reprogram neurological pathways within the brain for treating neurological diseases such as autism, things along those lines.
Well, we're making very rapid progress on understanding the genetic triggers. We're not quite there yet. There's actually very exciting work in Alzheimer's and understanding what causes that. One very important insight actually came from a 16-year-old girl, Laura Deming, that I've been mentoring. She's a Peter Thiel 20 under 20 fellow. She's now 18. But we are beginning to really understand sometimes fairly simple genetic triggers that have a cascade effect. I think we will get to the point where we can arrest the progression of these diseases over the next decade or so. It's a little bit hard to predict exactly, but the power of these technologies is scaling up exponentially. If you have a progressive disease like Alzheimer's, and let's say you completely stop it, and then let's say you use stem cell therapies to repopulate the brain, to replace the brain tissue that's been destroyed, you will not bring back their skills, their memory, or even their personality that was wiped out. But you can grow new brain tissue and they can relearn these skills. We see that routinely in stroke patients. Even though they don't replace the tissue, if the stroke is localized, there's still enough other brain tissue then to compensate. So, once the information is lost, you'd have to think of a very exotic technology that could possibly bring that back. The information in our brains, and it is real information, this is not just a metaphor, that represents our skills, our personality, our memories, is not backed up today. We will get to a point where we've expanded our neocortex into the cloud, and at least the cloud portion will be backed up, and that's going to grow exponentially. So you go out far enough to 2040s, 2050s, that'll be where the action is, and it'll be backed up. But right now, today, it's lost. But you could, if you can arrest the genetic triggers of those diseases and then repopulate their brain, we've shown the feasibility at small scale to grow new brain tissue from stem cells, then at least they could basically learn these things over again.
Thank you.
This is a converse of the first question. One of your partners, Peter Diamandis, says land is of abundance in a few years. Food, healthcare, and solar power, all these would become cheap, and you would go to a very low cost, so nobody has to work to really get their basic needs. But what can stop this? Can governments close everything and become a closed system like North Korea, where things can be stopped, or is it really optimistic? Where are you on the optimistic versus pessimistic scale?
Well, just to illustrate the first part of your question, basic resources are getting less and less expensive. There's going to be a big revolution in education with online education. People say, oh, well, it doesn't have the social aspect, and there isn't the one-to-one communication needed, but that's actually all being overcome. It's like the objections we had to ebooks 3-4 years ago. We've had continual improvement in education. We've, just in the last 50 years, tripled the amount of education that a child gets in the developing world. Larry Page and I did an energy study for the National Academy of Engineering that was adopted that showed that solar energy is growing exponentially because we're applying nanotechnology, a form of information technology, to solar panels and energy storage. It's doubling every 2 years the total amount of solar energy produced in the world. It has been for 30 years. And we're now less than 7 doublings away from meeting 100% of our energy needs. I presented this recently to the Prime Minister of Israel, and he said, and he was actually in my class at the Sloan School in the 1970s, and he said, Ray, but do we have enough sunlight to do this with? And I said, yes, we have 10,000 times more than we need. Once we double 7 more times and are meeting all of our energy needs, we'll be using 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight. There's similar revolutions coming in water and food. I don't have time to describe them. Land usage, I mean, people say, oh, we're going to run out of space. We're only crowded together because of the innovation of cities so that we could communicate. Take a train trip anywhere in the world, you'll see most of the space is unused. We'll be able to print out houses at very low cost using 3-dimensional printers, Lego style. So this is actually the subject of Peter Diamandis' recent book called Abundance. We're only running out of resources like energy and water and food if we restrict ourselves to 19th century first industrial revolution technologies. If we use these new emerging information-based technologies, there's tremendous abundance. What could disrupt this really is only existential meltdowns. So the first one was introduced around the time I was born. We now have enough thermonuclear weapons that could be a complete meltdown of civilization. People don't worry about them so much anymore, but they're still there. These new technologies could be deployed negatively. I mentioned the possibility of a biological virus being engineered to be destructive, and we're not defenseless against that. I worked with the Army to put in a rapid response system to deal with that, but it's not a pat solution. Those solutions are very quickly obsolete as the potential attacks get more sophisticated. A good analogy or example of that is how we deal with software viruses. There were early predictions that the internet would never take root because software viruses would become more sophisticated and there'd be no way for those networks to develop because software viruses would destroy them. And one part of that prediction came true. Software viruses have become more and more sophisticated, but the defense has also kept pace with it. And we're constantly reinventing this technological immune system we have. And it actually has prevented any kind of catastrophic failure of the internet. We need to do the same thing with our protections against these other existential risks like biological viruses and Nanotechnology, once it gets going, could also have similar properties of being self-replicating. So there are dangers. Technology is a double-edged sword. We need the right policy to actually put a very high priority on keeping these technologies safe, while we have entrepreneurs and innovators like we have in this room who will be applying these exponentially growing technologies to making the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ray. We appreciate you being here. A couple last announcements. We're winding down here. It's time for the NCAA basketball tournament. So TAG does its own thing in partnership with our friends from Arceti. It's called the Tweet 16, and it's actually going on right now. And you can go to www.techtweettournament.com and participate in that. Right now, there's a competition between Atlantic Tech Village and LexisNexis. And it's all to drive traffic to our State of the Industry report. The other thing that I want to call your attention to is the back of your brochure. This is your call to action, as the room is smoking up here. Call to action for today. I talked about Invest Georgia, which is really a significant thing happening for our state. This is a bill that would produce for our entrepreneurs, our early stage and growth stage companies, $100 million over 5 years to invest in our companies. And you can help on this. This is your assignment for today. You can help on this by going to the QR code, or you can see the link there that you can go to and get your message to the legislators in terms of how important this is. And finally, I'd like to call Barry back up here. And it takes a leader. We had a great team in terms of the group that put this together, our task force, but we did have a chairman, and he did a terrific job. And Barry, I want to thank you for everything, give you this recognition. Thank you very much. You can adjourn the meeting if you like.
Well, thank you all for being here. Look forward to seeing you again in 2014. Thanks to our speakers, thanks to the TAG team, and look forward to seeing you next year. Safe travels.